Welcome to Pacific Mammal Research's Marine Mammal Highlight Series. We are a 501c3 research and education nonprofit studying marine mammals in the Salish Sea off Washington State. In this series, you will learn about different marine mammals as we discuss interesting facts about each species. This is our way to geek out, share some information, and have some fun. We hope you enjoy the series, and be sure to follow us on Instagram to vote for which animal we talk about next. And without further ado, welcome to the PacMam podcast. I'm Cindy.
And I'm Kat.
And this week we had the Battle of the Pygmies. And so it was the battle between the Pygmy sperm whale and the Pygmy right whale for this marine mammal highlight. And surprisingly, I think we both thought that the sperm whale was going to win.
Totally thought that was going to win because it's really cool looking. Like, I mean, we'll get to that one at some point, but definitely thought that one was going to win.
Yeah, and I actually got to do it helped euthanize and then do a necropsy on a Pygmy sperm whale.
Oh wow!
Yeah, so that'll be cool when we get to talk about it. Yeah, but the Pygmy right whale won out, and I think Kat and I were talking, and we both think that maybe it was because people were like, "What? There's a Pygmy right whale," and I was also kind of like that, like, "Wait, what?" So I think curiosity won out for that one.
Yeah, for sure.
But so this spoiler alert, we don't know a lot about this species. And I have a quote from the American Cetacean Society on their webpage, and this really sums it up. Information about this whale is sketchy at best.
There we go. That's the title of the podcast right there.
Yep,
it's sketchy
at best. Since only a few dozen stranded specimens have been examined by scientists and very rarely seen at sea, which we'll talk about. But so this one's going to be a little bit shorter, although I do have some pretty cool and interesting new research stuff that's going on. But then we're going to have a bonus animal for you afterwards, because in the realm of looking at these different pygmy whales, we came across one that was even more weird than this one. So we're going to give you a little bonus animal on this one, and then maybe answer a listener question at the end. So with that, we'll get started, and Kat will tell us what we know about where these guys are and what they look like, even though we barely ever see them.
Right, exactly. Well, and actually it's surprising because there was quite a good level of description in terms of what they look like. So we obviously know enough about what they look like that it was a pretty extensive appearance description. So let's start there.
That's what helps with the strandings. Like, you can literally see, like, really study the animal. That helps.
That's true. So basically, although the Pygmy right whales are classified in with the other right whales, so the northern and southern right whales and the bowheads, but they really only have one thing in common, and that is the shape of the mouth. So the upper jaw is arched. So again, think bowhead whale, right? That's the most pronounced kind of arch in that upper jaw. And the lower jaw is bowed out. So that basically kind of, that sort of weird combo is unique to these particular species. And it does say that the particular bowing of that lower jaw seems to become more pronounced with age. So that's something we can presumably use to guesstimate the age of the animal as well.
I think that their mouths look really fun, like the bowhead and the right whales. Like, it's just this big giant frown.
Yeah, it does for sure. And we did our bowhead episode, like like learning about the head structure. So go listen to that episode because it's awesome. It's so fascinating. Anyway, we're not talking about bowheads today.
But go listen to that podcast.
Reining myself back in. So this lower jaw does extend slightly beyond that upper jaw, so they have a little bit of an underbite there. And they have two like grooves basically on the throat, which are similar to the throat grooves in a gray whale. So it's kind of lengthways in that throat, and it does say indistinct, so presumably they're not as prominent as in some other whales.
Yeah, we're looking at the pictures. I didn't really notice them.
Yeah. So apparently that's more of a physiological feature, but it's not necessarily as pronounced as some of the other baleen whales.
And I'm gonna put a pin on that, because when we talk about the research, that's gonna make sense as to why they have some forms that are more like gray whales, or more like those kind of whales versus the right whales. And
okay, yeah, okay, we'll get there. So this whale, in contrast to some of the other ones that we've just talked about, this does have a small head. So again, tying into the pygmy right whale name, takes up only a quarter of its total body length, which to me seems still really big.
Still really big.
In proportion to like a bowhead whale, fair enough.
Right.
The blow for this animal is small and not very noticeable, which goes into partly why they're so difficult to see, because typically, especially with these larger baleen whales, we are most often noticing the blow first. Sticking with their mouths for a little bit more here, talking about the baleen plates. So there are 210 to 230 baleen plates on each side of the pygmy right whale's upper jaw. So again, like weirdly specific because we have that stranding data. Like this,
Right.
it's odd where like there's some really specific details in here, but we don't really know anything.
Yeah, we know a lot about this, but nothing else.
Right. So it's really interesting. And the baleen plates for these guys are kind of that yellowish color with a dark brown band on the edge of the baleen plates, which is so quite distinctive, which is pretty cool.
I heard it termed it was creamy, like a creamy white. I was like, that's a fun.
Yeah, right. Like kind of like a beigey, creamy white color. Interesting. These baleen plates can get up to about 27 inches long and are thought to be more flexible and stronger than those of any other species of baleen whale.
Really?
Yeah, which is kind of fascinating. So I don't know why that is, but
they don't feed on anything different as far as we know than everybody else does. So
yeah, these guys are kind of crazy.
Yeah, well, that is for sure. More about that.
Who knows? I feel like a lot of what we're going to be saying is like, that's weird. Who knows why? Just be prepared, everyone. Yes. So moving on to other areas of their appearance beyond just their mouth. So in terms of length, again, we are talking about a pygmy animal. So these guys are about 20 feet-ish in length. The largest known female pygmy right whale was recorded at 21 feet. So it seems like their males are slightly smaller than females, but it's right around that sort of 18 to 20 foot range. Weight has been estimated at about 5 tons for them. So again, they're small in relation to other right whale species, not necessarily small in the grand scheme of things, but they are smaller.
Right. That's what you're doing. It's the smallest of the baleen whale species. That's all relative. It's still pretty big.
Right. Exactly. Exactly. So in terms of seeing them, if you were lucky enough to get to see them in the wild, what they look like, they are a dark gray on their upper side of the body. Apparently that gets darker and darker as they age. And the underside of the body is white. So again, very similar coloring to a lot of other baleen species. They have that darker color on top, the lighter color underneath. They do have 2 distinct chevrons on the side of the body. So they're kind of stripes, but known as chevrons. And they have a smaller dorsal fin, which is located about 2/3 of the way back on the body. One of the cool things too is that the flippers are apparently considerably darker than the rest of the body and are smaller and narrower than other species. So that was kind of interesting. So they have little sort of T-Rex flippers that are darker. I always just, whenever they say smaller, but then proportionally to the rest of the body, I just think of T-Rex hands and I can't go back.
Yeah, I go there too. I always go to Rex from Toy Story where he can't play the game because his arms are too short.
Right, exactly. So yeah, slightly smaller and darker flippers. And interesting, again, something that we know from these stranded animals is their skeletal structure. So apparently they have 17 pairs of broad, flat ribs, which are more than any other baleen whale as well.
They're packing a lot into this little animal.
Right. And so like, apparently they extend 2/3 of the way back the body. So it's like 2/3 of the length towards the tail. So we'll put a pin in this too, because I know you're going to talk about it, but they have flagged this. Some scientists have flagged this as potential evidence for suggesting they should be in their own family. So we'll put a pin in that because I know we're going to circle back to that when we get closer to the end. So that's kind of what they look like. Again, darker on top, lighter underneath, those kind of chevron stripes on the side, and little tiny flippers that are dark, small indistinct blow. And in terms of where you might happen to see these guys, they're found in the southern hemisphere, in temperate water. Sightings occur very rarely, but if you are likely to see them, it's in Tasmania year-round, seasonally along parts of southern Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, the Falkland Islands, and some areas of Antarctica. So basically the southern hemisphere is what we're seeing. It's kind of all over those temperate waters of the southern hemisphere, but again, highly unlikely to actually see them.
Yes. And I'll add one more thing about their looks is that many reported sightings are likely incorrectly identified as minke whales because the small size, dark color, curved dorsal fin, it's almost impossible to tell them apart at the surface.
So we may actually be seeing these guys more than we think and just assuming that they're minke whales.
Or vice versa.
Or vice versa. Okay,
Yeah.
interesting. There
Yeah.
we go.
So
that's what I have for their visuals and distribution.
So I guess I would just like, all right, so it's like a minke, just a little bit smaller, and you can't tell the difference.
But again, like looking at pictures, it makes total sense as to why it would be so difficult to tell these guys apart, especially at a distance or in the. I mean, really, you would have to see their rostrum, like their face, because that's the way you would be able to tell, I would assume, because minkies have a very unique and distinctive rostrum shape. So
yeah. And I think I saw in some of on a couple of places that the one behavior that they tend to do is stick their rostrum out of the water a little bit.
Oh, almost like a spy hopping kind of?
Not a spy hop, because they don't do that.
Okay.
But it's something like where I forgot what they were talking about, because it wasn't, we didn't see it on multiple places, so I wasn't sure, how sure we were, again, with any of this, but
yeah,
that was something that kept popping up here and there, that they will stick their nose out at the surface, but it's not a full spy hop or anything like that.
Okay, interesting.
Might have been with their surfacing or something, I'm not sure, but anyway, so they're that is something that could help to differentiate at the surface.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So with that, we'll move into the diet and behavior, which is going to be interesting, but not that long. Because they really, literally, they've only been seen. They've reported a few sightings in the actual water, and almost everything that we know comes from strandings. Right. Even on some of the research that I'm going to talk about later, it'll be like 9 sightings and then 190 strandings that they're using for their data. So
interesting.
We don't know a lot about their actual behavior. We do know that they eat they're filter feeders, just like all the other baleen whales. So copepods, small euphausids. But they did find some stranded individuals with krill, so probably take some of that as well. And they're likely skim feeders, not lungers and like humpback whales.
Okay.
So the skim, like right whales are, they just kind of on the surface. Skim feed. And that goes along with their dive patterns. They dive and remain submerged for up to 4 minutes. That's like the max that they.
Oh wow.
Yeah, it's
interesting.
Very long.
Yeah.
Which makes sense. If they're skim feeders, they're not really going to be diving that much. And I guess maybe if they have that many ribs too, they don't have to worry about diving deep.
Right.
Associated problems. And again, this is all with a little asterisk. Like max has been 4 minutes, but there's been relatively few sightings. So is that a true indication of how long they dive? We don't know. But for the information that we have. So they're, again, rarely seen at sea. They are the smallest of the baleen whale species. And this is where I got in trouble once, because I thought the minke whale was the smallest. And technically it's the smallest we have here in the Sailor Sea. But one of my friends was like, oh, just so you know, the pygmy right whale. And I was like, what's pygmy right whale? Is the actual smallest.
There you go.
So from what we know, they are solitary or travel in pairs. But they have been seen in small groups of up to 80. I'm not really sure how that constitutes a small group. But that's the word.
Yeah, that seems like a big group, especially when we don't normally see them. Like that seems.
If they're only in 1 or 2, how is 80 a small group? And especially for baleen whales, you don't normally see baleen whales in groups of 80 unless they're on the reproductive grounds or whatever.
Right. Huh.
So anyway, I had in parentheses small ? So they're again kind of similar to porpoises, where we see them alone or in groups of 1 to 2 or 3, but occasionally we see them in groups of hundreds, 100 to 200. So kind of a similar idea. And as far as it is known, they don't do any of the typical whale behaviors, as Kat kind of mentioned before, like breaching, spy hop, showing flukes, like fluke up diving. Again, probably because they're not diving very far, and they don't really need to fluke up to do that. So interesting that they're like this weird. They're a really weird species. It's just like we're not going to do anything like anybody else at all. And really cool, they did have at least one underwater observation. of one animal
Ooh.
revealed an entirely different swimming technique.
What?
Yeah.
No
So,
way.
yeah. So instead of like most marine mammal or most cetaceans, they just move the tail area and the flukes, right? So the peduncle area and the flukes are the thing that move. These guys flex the entire body in waves of motion from head to tail to move through the water. It's like a
They're doing the worm. They're doing
yeah,
the
they're doing
worm
the
through
worm in the
through
water.
What?
Yeah, I was
That's
like
wild.
bonkers.
Why?
I don't know. Like it's not like
Would
they're
that have to do,
huge.
would
Like
that have to do with those extra ribs where they have less flexibility at the back of the body, so they have to like undulate
do
the
the whole
whole
thing.
body to make that because it's less flexible in that back. I have so many
Yeah,
questions.
I know. Well, that's the point of this
Wow.
episode. It's just gonna be more and more questions.
I had no idea. That's so cool.
I know, and that's the thing. Like, okay, we don't know much, and then we know there's one really weird thing. Like, whoa, what's going on? Why are you doing this? And like, why are you different than literally every other whale on the planet?
Well, and like you said before, that's one isolated incident. So it's like, is that even
it was an injured animal.
typical? Is that just one injured animal? And we've only ever seen that one injured animal under the water. And maybe that's why it was able to be observed. Like, who knows?
Yeah.
Wow, that's so crazy.
Yeah. So I'm hoping they find more
Cool.
underwater observations because I want to know if this is like a normal
That
thing
is super cool.
So let's see. They have swimming speeds of 3 to 8 knots and that have been noted, and they leave a conspicuous wake when doing so, which I thought was interesting. Didn't really think of whales leaving wakes,
but if they're swimming funny,
this right,
that would create more turbulence in the water if they're
if you're
moving
like
their
doing
entire
this,
body. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Makes sense. Yeah.
So many questions.
These guys are so weird.
Oh, this is so cool.
Yeah. Okay, so I think that's all I have for the behavior, and then reproduction is going to be real short. Okay, so there's no information. We have no idea what they do, how often they do it. They just basically say like, well, if they're other right whales or whatever, you know. Which, although again, this isn't a right whale, it's kind of a misnomer, which we'll talk about more in a little bit. But there have been a few pregnant females that have stranded in shallow waters. That may indicate that they move to the shallow coastal areas to give birth, but there is some evidence that they move inshore in spring and summer, regardless of anything else, likely for food, food changes and stuff like that. And when they're inshore, they seek out sheltered shallow bays. So that's all I got.
Interesting. Okay. Wow.
And they don't know. I don't think they'd even, they don't know how often they give birth or how long gestation is or anything else. So.
Makes sense.
Yeah, because we just have barely seen them. And there's only so much with that we can get from strandings, because if you don't get, they've had some pregnant females that have stranded, but do we have one from each, first trimester, second trimester, like, if it's 11-month gestation, do we have it all the way through, or we've only gotten ones that are early pregnancy, so we don't really know exactly what that looks like. So, so that's it for behavior and reproduction. They're really weird, and we don't know too much about them. So we're going to take a quick break, and then we'll come back to the threats and the status, which will be real short as well. But I have some cool stuff with the new research. So we will be back in just a minute after a quick break. All right, we're back, and Kat's going to tell us really quickly about their status and threats.
Super short. So basically, we are data deficient. We don't know enough to know what sort of status these guys have in our waters. Populations past or present are not known. So basically, we have no idea what their former numbers were, what their current numbers are, and therefore, again, typically that just means you are data deficient in the IUCN Red List of endangered species. So in terms of threats, again, because we don't really know anything about them, we don't really know what their threats are. However, that in itself can be a threat, right? Because we have such little understanding of these animals, we really have no idea how we are impacting them, how the environmental changes that are occurring are impacting them, how their food sources are doing. So we don't have any specific threats for these guys, but that in itself is a threat. Because if we don't know anything, we have no way to conserve or manage or protect or even learn more about specific things that we know impact them. So a little bit concerning in that respect, because we really have no clue how these guys are doing. But that's it. That's what we got. We don't know, basically.
I don't know.
Short answer, we don't know.
We've not seen them. We barely see them, and we don't know. And I think since they do live down more in some, well, the temperate and some cooler waters, climate change might be a bit more of an issue for them than other species, as we've talked about before. But yeah, basically, the threat is that we don't know anything.
Yeah, which is a big threat. That's a big problem. So,
and these guys are so freaking cool. Okay, so I was like, there's not going to be that much after going through the big diet and behavior on new research, right? Because we've had that with other animals where like there's nothing too recent, or at least that I could find. But there's actually some really interesting things, and it just makes people ask more questions on this guy. So in a 2013 study by Fordyce and Marks, this called The Last of the Cetothers. So they were using New Zealand specimens, so that a lot of this, like, since they're over by that way, a fair amount, a lot of the specimens come from there. So they looked at a lot of different life stages. So they looked at the morphology, right? The morphology is the shape of what it looks like. And basically what they came down to is that their body maybe these guys may be the last survivor of a supposedly extinct family, the Cetotheridae. It was thought to go extinct about 2 million years ago. And right now they're in their own family, the Neobelinidae, right? And again, as we talked about before, they're called the pygmy right whale. The one thing they have in common is the bowing of the mouth, but nothing else really makes them fit as a right whale. So they have them in their own family. So this is very interesting that they thought this family was extinct, but now looking at the morphological stuff, they actually think that they should be part of that. So this is the only extant, meaning living, member of that family. Now, that was in 2013, but when you look at all the taxonomy and everything, it still says Neobelinidae. So I don't think that they've
haven't changed it yet, perhaps.
Right, they haven't agreed to that, I guess. But it's an interesting question. And so then also linking to that, in 2015, there was another one, basically that these guys might be the missing link for finding ancestor-descendant relationships. So they are, we're always trying to find the missing link, right? Of like this ancestor and this descendant, right? You think that they're related, but we don't have the one that has the intermediate features between the two, right? We don't have that fossil, right? That's the same thing for when we're looking for human evolution and all sorts of animals. Like, how did we get from there to there? And we have a lot of ones in between, but sometimes there's a big jump. You're like, where does that connect? So they used the only reported fossil, and compared with extant juvenile and adult specimens. I didn't write that down well. They looked at one specific fossil that they had, and then they looked at these juvenile and adult specimens. And the fossil was phylogenetically in between the juvenile and the adult living specimens, or extant ones, not living.
Okay, so the fossil of the pygmy right whale fell in between the juvenile and the adult pygmy right whale specimens that we have from now.
Right. And so
interesting.
That kind of thing is like, so the juvenile still has some of the old, and you were talking about how their jaw changes in shape a little bit as they get older. So there's something about the difference in morphology between juveniles and adults that helps us kind of understand evolution of how things have changed. So the fact that this fossil was in between those two makes them think that might be the missing link for this species.
Interesting.
Yeah, because that one was talking about looking at, because originally there was tooth, and then they went to baleen. So where is that connection? And so this is possibly the first identified with baleen whales for that missing link ancestor-dependent descendant relationship.
Cool.
So very cool. Let's see, the next one I have. So this one's from 2017, and a lot of these are from the same. There's like 3 names that keep popping up that are doing research on the pygmy right whales. And these guys they noted that there's unusual specializations of pygmy right whales in the visual pigments, the mitochondrial tRNAs, and the postcranial anatomy, right, the back of the head, basically, that suggest a different lifestyle from other extant whales. Right? And we've talked about that because they seem to not do anything like any other whale. So they found 2 new Pleistocene fossils, so a certain time back in the past, that provide evidence that there was a brief and relatively recent period in geological history where they occurred in the northern hemisphere. Yeah,
interesting.
So, and I'll get to one in just a second that even confirms that more. They had and actually right now. So that was the fossil, but then in 2018, they had the first stranding record of an actual stranded animal in the northern hemisphere.
Wow.
So, and unfortunately, they couldn't get the actual animal, but they didn't have photos from the Marine Mammal Program that took those photos, and took good enough photos that they could identify it as a pygmy right whale. So they, in all the other things, it's like, oh, it's just been the southern hemisphere, like that's just where they are. They're nowhere else. But now there's this, again, weird. You're totally in the southern hemisphere, but maybe you weren't, and maybe you're not now. Like, that's interesting. So where they were and are is still up to some debate.
Cool.
So we have another one by Kemper. These two studies are by Kemper, and they were looking at Australasian region of the area, looking at where these guys are. So again, 9 sightings, 180 carcasses, so heavily on the stranding. But they did find that the regions differed with what age class was more abundant. So pre-weaning juveniles were found more north of 41 degrees. South of that, subadults were more prominent, and neonates were found between 35 and 47 degrees. So there does seem to be some stratification of age class where they are. They did see feeding behavior observed in the coastal waters of Australia, which is kind of what is thought. And then they did opportunistic sightings in 2013 and 196 strandings looking from 1884 to 2007, very long time. And they found hotspots of where most of them strand. And these hotspots accounted for 61% of the records. And these were all the hotspots had upwelling and or high zooplankton abundance.
Okay.
Makes sense, right? That's a good place to eat. The whales are going to be there. The whales occurred in all months, but 75% of the time in the spring and summer. So again, likely that they're coming in the spring and summer to feed on these upwelling events. And they did note that upwelling and productivity likely quickly are beneficial. So the species like these during climatic phenomena. So like when it's a bad El Nino year, these types of events are going to be even more important for these animals. So again, just linking that, like, we need to know more about these kind of things to know how to protect them. In 2020, there's one in 2022. I was very excited to see that, like, very recent, by Tanaka et al. And they were looking at the skimming behavior, feeding by skimming, and they looked at the rostrum morphologies to test the hypothesis that specific morphologies facilitate special feeding strategies. So they looked at a lot of different species morphologies. Or actually, no, they looked at the right whale and the pygmy right whale. So they wanted to compare those two. And they looked at, I believe they looked at other ones as well, but for the pygmy right whale, they compared it with the right whale and found that they both shifted to skim feeding from ancestors that likely did lunge feeding independently. So again, kind of going back to like that these guys are different than right whales. They're not a lineage broken off from them. So, and that I had that little note. Does this go along with the fact that they're similar but in different families? Possibly. In 2017, Park et al. Looked at the inner ear cochlea. It's the first time they've ever looked at that. So it's a structure inside your inner ear. And they have large, and they're very large and sensitive to low frequency sounds, but the hearing limit is relatively high. So they are sensitive to the low, but they can hear much higher than we would have thought. And so this goes back to if they are supposed to be as a balinid, which is the right head and the bowhead whales, if they're supposed to be with that group, or are they more like the balinopterids, which are your rorquals like humpbacks and things like that, and gray whales. And so the from the inner ear, the well-developed tympanal recess links it stronger with the cedotherids, right? The one that I talked about before, the supposedly extinct family, and the balaenopterids, the rorquals and the gray whales, rather than the balenids, which are the right and left whales. So despite the fact that they morphologically look like bowhead and right whales to some degree, they have a lot of more things in common with either that extinct family or the balaenopterids.
Wow, weird.
So again, weird.
We don't really, they don't really fit in.
No, they're the complete misfit, I think, is what we're getting here.
Yeah.
And then the last one I have is from 2018, Worth et al. And this was looking at how the filtration works on different baleen species and stuff like that. They looked at the functional morphology and hydrodynamics of the filtering apparatus, aka the baleen, of 10 different species, and they found that this is really cool. They had a balenid type filter from a 2D analysis, so it looks like the right whale, bowhead whale, when you look at it 2D. But if you look at enhanced 3D modeling, it shows the baleen filter fits better with the rorquals.
Weird.
So they have
they're straddling almost these two different types of whale. Fascinating.
Yeah. So they have like the mouth of the right-head bow whales, but then everything inside it and other parts of them are much more like the other species of whales. Yeah. So these guys are super weird and super cool, and there's so many more questions, and they do seem like they're straddling the two worlds, which is really, really interesting. So
yeah.
It'll be neat as we get better about being able to be out in those open ocean areas and maybe being able to find them. Maybe drones are going to be able to help with that at some point.
Yeah.
Could be really, really cool.
That's a surprising amount of research on them, though, given that we see them so rarely. That's a lot more than I was expecting.
There's other species that are much more commonly known or easier to access that have less research than the amount that I found there. So
yeah, that's fascinating.
I mean, maybe it's more on there because of that, right? They're like, well, let's get as much as we can from these strandings.
True.
And whatnot, but very cool. So the little pygmy right whale, the little misfit of the I
have one fun fact before we close out about the pygmy right whale. So yeah, we got the name. So their Latin name is Caparia marginata. Caparia means wrinkle in Latin, which refers to the wrinkled appearance of the ear bone. While marginata translates to enclosed with a border, referring to the dark border around the baleen plate, so that some individuals have that kind of darker.
So completely named on the baleen, and
and the ear, the ear bone.
That's weird.
Isn't that crazy?
Since that one study was the first time they looked at the inner ear.
Well, I mean, that was looking at the cochlea, but who knows what the other inner ear bones they were. It's probably just one that somebody found on the beach when they found a stranded animal and was like, that looks weird. It's all wrinkly. There you go.
Oh, they were right, because it probably is really weird compared to everybody else. That seems to be the MO for these guys.
That's their Latin name. Kind of fun.
Awesome. Well, that's what we have for the superly awesome and weird pygmy right whale. Kat has a short little thing that she's going to tell us about a pygmy fin whale, because we were looking and this one seems weird in a different way. Yeah.
So switching gears a little bit here, but staying on this theme of misfits. So there is apparently such a thing as a pygmy fin whale. However, it has not yet been genetically substantiated. So this was something that was apparently reported in 1865 by a guy called Burmeister, who proposed a new species of whale.
Is that the Burmeister porpoise guy?
It might be. I'm assuming it's probably the same guy. I'm not 100% sure, but I would guess.
Yeah, there's a Burmeister porpoise, so it makes sense. Yeah.
That would make sense. It's an unusual name.
Yeah.
So he basically initially proposed this as a new species, which of course then it was plopped under the rest of the fin whale families. So there are currently 4 subspecies of fin whale that are considered valid. So we have the North Atlantic fin whale. I'm not going to do the Latin names because it gets extensive, but the North Atlantic fin whale, the North Pacific fin whale, and then 2 different subspecies, including this pygmy subspecies, are found in the Southern Hemisphere. Okay.
Okay.
So again, this was first proposed in 1865, and then a guy named Clark proposed the pygmy as a subspecies in a 2004 paper. So that seems to be kind of when this first was initiated as a subspecies of the fin whales. That was based on basically one physically mature female, which was caught in the Antarctic in like 1947 or something. Some physically mature fin whales caught by the Japanese, and some smaller, darker, sexually immature fin whales caught in the Antarctic, which was proposed as basically a migratory phase. So effectively, we have like a handful of these that we've maybe seen ever. What they call the type specimen, so the animal that was used as that first initial distinguisher as a different animal, is currently in a natural history museum in Argentina. That was a stranding. And so basically, this has kind of just been assumed to be a subspecies for a long time, but we basically have never seen it again. So it's apparently smaller than the other fin whale species, so 18 to 24 meters with darker coloration. So when you Google it and you look at pictures, it's basically like a small dark fin whale, reportedly with black baleen, which is super cool.
It is very
right? Cool. Yeah. And one of the important distinguishers is that it seems to have been restricted to low to mid latitudes in the southern hemisphere. So that kind of is also kind of just spatially what has distinguished it in the literature anyway from the other southern hemisphere subspecies. However, aside from this original description and then Clark's proposition in 2004 to make this a subspecies, there's basically no other known specimens that have been positively identified as pygmy fin whales for morphological comparison. So, does it exist?
I don't know.
Was this a misnomer in the first place? Was this something that existed and now no longer exists, or it's so rare that we can't find it? Is this, I love this phrasing, is this in fact a delinquent juvenile? Which I love that. I'm like, isn't that awesome? Delinquent juvenile of the other southern hemisphere species, subspecies, which has been studied and found repeatedly. So basically what I found, which was really interesting, is that several genetic studies are basically saying anything we could find suggests that there really is just the one southern hemisphere subspecies genetically.
These would just be like a weirdo specimens from
some weird, right? Maybe a weird morph, maybe a weird life, again, delinquent juvenile life stage that they're just like but again, odd that they would look so vastly different visually in these records.
But like if you look up, like I think is it the common dolphin? There's like 30 different color morphs of the same species. So, and there's, and that's an extreme case. Like, and there's one of our colleagues did a picture of all the different morphs they have, and it's a poster. It's amazing. Like, yeah, they look like completely different species to some degree. And so not every species has that many, but there are quite a few that have these different color morphs, and yeah, like they're not necessarily different species; they're just slightly different variations.
Well, and even thinking about a little bit more tangible example, but like we have things called white tigers. They're unusual. They are still considered to be a tiger, but they're we kind of have these weird, these animals that have like weird pigmentation sometimes that just pop out as a genetic anomaly. And so again, because these have been so infrequently found and basically are completely unsubstantiated at this point, because we really have, I mean, aside from that original animal that's preserved and then these other kind of handful of reports, we have no evidence that this exists even. So were those just weird morphs of the known southern hemisphere subspecies? Possibly. So basically that was just kind of cool to read about that, because several like recent genetic studies in like 2018 2019 basically saying that anything they found, they did an extensive actually eDNA study across the southern hemisphere fin whales populations, and effectively found no genetic difference between any of the fin whale species that they were finding. They're all just kind of one subspecies. So there's basically saying, look, even if we
cause it be something
even if we were sampling any pygmy animals within this range, they're genetically not different enough for us to be able to tell. So yeah, kind of fascinating. A weird one where it's like we're kind of at the point of like genetically this has not even been substantiated. Does this even exist? And yet it's on. We're considered by the Society of Marine Mammalogy, it is still on there as a subspecies, but genetically we can't actually prove that it exists, which is kind of fascinating.
And that goes to like, again, it's like two things. Where do we delineate a species, right? What is it? Is it
Yeah.
morphological? Is it genetic? Is it both now because we can do genetics? And then at what point of genetics does it change, right? Like there's going to be variation within a population. At what point can we all agree where the line is of this is too much variation to be the same species? I don't think we've agreed upon that yet for many. And then is there just that variation? So it's and then the second one is how long it takes to be able to confirm one way or the other, right? So
Yeah.
somebody comes up with this. So back in that day, they just got put in the list or whatever the process was back then.
Right.
But it's still there, even though we can't substantiate it. So what is the process of what it takes to get something removed or added on? It's a process, and everybody, like, has to be multiple lines of evidence, and then everybody kind of agrees, and then it goes to this taxonomic group that decides, I guess. I don't know the particulars, but it's not an easy process. So it may be a while before we officially. And I think maybe it's harder to take one off once it's on, because
well, especially if you have one example of that
right,
animal that's literally preserved in a natural history museum, like, oh, it's there, look at it, it exists.
right, and maybe it did, and it's extinct now, and then that's the only thing we have of it, so it should be there. But
Right.
yeah,
And
so
again, I mean, it circles back to what you were talking about at the beginning, like with these animals that live in the Southern Ocean in general, or the Southern Hemisphere, it's a lot harder to study them in general. So, a lot of it could just be that we just don't have the knowledge or the research happening to show us these very rare individuals as often as perhaps they're existing. So who knows?
And I think
But yeah,
too
kind of
that
a weird one.
it's better to be conservative on, like, well, if it's already been there, let's leave it there because it might possibly be a thing, and not take it
Right.
off prematurely and then be like, oh crap, we got to put it back on there.
Right. Yeah,
So it
exactly.
makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, well, very cool. I mean, I think this is a continuing theme again in the Southern Hemisphere. I think many of the animals we've been talking about, and hopefully in the future we'll know more about them. But very, very cool. I just that one seemed to fit very well with the pygmy right whale today, since we don't know where it fits, and then it's like, does this one even? And then does the pinwheel one even exist? I don't know.
Right.
Crazy.
You guys get a bonus weirdo. Look at
Right?
that.
2 weirdos today, along with the 2 weirdos today that are giving you the presentations here.
Always.
So one final thing, just real quick, we're gonna do. We a couple of weeks ago, or maybe it might have been a couple months at this point, we had posted if you had questions for us, and we did have one come in. And they asked what was our favorite odontocete, so toothed whale, dolphin, or porpoise. So we're gonna hopefully do that quickly. Do you have one? It's a hard question because we love.
I was gonna say
it's really hard to pick one, and you feel like you're betraying.
Yeah.
So
I know it's. I know. I feel like it's. I mean, I hate to be cliche, but I'm gonna say killer whale.
Oh man, you betrayed.
I know.
Betrayed us.
I know, but like from like yeah, and I mean I also like again like where I grew up, and we got to see killer whales like in like right below my house, and just I mean they're one of the ones that for me was pivotal in piquing my interest in marine mammals in general, because they're just so intense.
So
I mean, and I think like
they're just
they are, but I think for me like just and again obviously all cetaceans are intelligent, but just there's something about killer whales and orcas in general, but just their hunting style, and I've kind of always been drawn to top predators. So for me, like, I've always kind of said if I didn't study marine mammals, I probably would have studied wolves. Like there is something that I just find really fascinating about that sort of strategy that they have, and just their intense social bonds and things like that. Like it just, again, hate to be a cliche, but that probably again it's a hard question, because I think they're all really, really cool, but I would have to probably go with that as being like just simply because it was so instrumental in
getting
getting me fascinated and like really captivated in this world, and like, okay, this is like I have to study these things. So
yeah, and you're definitely not alone. Like that is.
I know, that's what I'm saying. I hate to be the cliche person, but it's like I like orcas, but
it's the gateway cetacean for other marine
mammals. Kind of that and bottlenose dolphins. I feel like are the two funnels.
Yep, pretty much.
How about you?
So I'm gonna cop out a little bit and not be able to choose one, because I feel like with harbor porpoises, I feel like I'm betraying them if I don't say they're my favorite, because it's what we study, right? And
I feel like that should just be implied always for people when they ask us this question. So the implied answer is always just harbor porpoise, always to all questions. But beyond that,
right?
Yeah.
And I think some of that's just because it's so exciting to be at a place where we're learning all these new things because we just don't know much about them at all. So everything is new and exciting, and we get to really contribute to the conservation of them because we're learning all these new things about them. So. And they're super cute, and I am always someone for the underdog. So they've been ignored, so I like to be the cheerleader and promoter. So harbor porpoises, and then this is where I'm going to betray myself in having to choose another one, a dolphin in particular. I have to go probably with spotted dolphins because that's what I studied in the Bahamas. Now, I also had to be the promoter for the underdog of the bottlenose dolphin there because everybody loves the spotted dolphins, but not as much the bottlenose dolphins. So I was always like, but the bottlenose dolphins are cool too, and so I feel a little bit bad choosing the spotted dolphins.
It's okay. They understand.
But they are like just what I got to experience there about basically living with them in their world on their terms, as is the motto for the Wild Dolphin Project. Getting to spend time with them, know those individuals, and be with them all summer basically, and see what they do and learn about their social structure. That was my whole work. So that is just too much part of my life to say no to. They're just really cool too, and they're really friendly and just really interesting to see. So harbor porpoises and spotted dolphins with the side of bottlenose dolphins probably is where I'm at.
I will say that the spotted dolphins are also a gateway into cetology because I definitely had a bunch of spotted dolphin posters on my wall, mostly because they are like the beauty, like there's so many beautiful images of spotted dolphins, and they're like the water that they swim in is like those beautiful crystal clear, Caribbean waters. And I had so many posters on my wall of spotted dolphins. So they were in there.
Yeah, they're
influential,
definitely photogenic. Like their spot patterns and stuff, and they change over time. So they're born like baby bottlenose dolphins, and then they gain spots as they get older. So by the time they're older, they're like covered with these mottled spots and everything. And so they are beautiful. They're very beautiful. And of course, the blue waters certainly do help. But I do want to remind everybody, it's not always that pretty when you're out there. Those are the good days. But in the end, yes, still very beautiful. So I hope you liked the answers to our questions there, even if we didn't fully pick one out. But those are our kind of favorite odontocetes and why. So if you guys have questions for us, feel free to reach out on social media. We'd love to answer more of those on the podcast. Don't forget that you can also subscribe to the podcast and get bonus episodes and ad-free. All the episodes are ad-free if you subscribe a paid subscription. And you get bonus episodes about, we just did one for field updates and other workshops we go to, and you're going to learn about each of us and how we got to where we are. So lots of cool stuff to find on there. And the subscription, the paid subscription really helps us as it helps us do more of these podcasts and education and continue our research. Funding is a difficult thing at best to get. So we appreciate your support. And you can also follow us on Instagram and Facebook. Keep an eye out on the Instagram stories for the next Marine Mammal Highlight poll. And that's where you can reach us to ask us for questions or tell us that you want to hear something, some topic that you want us to talk about as well. So with that, we will see you next time. Bye.
Bye.
This was brought to you by Pacific Mammal Research, a 501c3 nonprofit organization. To learn more about the species we discuss, check out our blog. Head to our website, www.pacmam.org, that's PACMAM.org, to check it out. Also, help us continue providing fun and educational content like this by donating today. Your help is how we can continue to do our work and share it with you. Thanks.